So good morning. Yeah, I wanted to see if y'all were awake. I'm honored to be invited to be here and to be giving the Bamford Lecture. Thank you. So, how many of you work with children? Okay. How many of the rest of you know children? Yeah. Who has ever been a child? We can kind of all identify here. So I'm talking about families of children with hearing loss and about a brain conversation. At one point or another, haven't we all been doing data logging and learned that the hearing aid was on for maybe 4 hours a day? What did we miss? What additional strategies can we use for having this critical condition of technology being worn? Have that happen? Have we had a brain talk? See, we as audiologists are steeped in auditory neurophysiology. We know how the auditory system works. We know that hearing occurs in the brain. We know that the purpose of technology is to get information to the brain. But do we really believe that our families know that hearing does not occur in ears? Hearing occurs in the brain. So how do we take our knowledge of auditory neurophysiology, neuroplasticity, auditory neural deprivation, how do we take all of our training and education and transform that knowledge into a narrative that we can use for counseling families? And what's our role in this family counseling that starts families on their journey of developing their child's brain? And the conversations we have about brain development actually apply to all children, not only children who have hearing loss. So let's begin with a very brief summary about what we know about the auditory brain. Now, there isn't obviously a little nugget in here labeled auditory brain, right? Human beings are steeped in auditorily designated tissue from the brainstem, midbrain, higher cortical areas, but that tissue won't develop until and unless it's activated with auditory information. We are, as humans, organically structured to listen and talk, provided that those pathways are actually accessed and activated. There's certainly a lot of references that support our knowledge of auditory neurophysiology. I've just listed a very few. We know that Kroll is one of the major researchers in this area, as is Anu Sharma and Kuhl and many others. We have references about outcomes, about what strategies we need to use in order to optimize outcomes for families. See, the point is we have a research base for our recommendations and for our management strategies. So just to kind of summarize some of what we know about auditory neurophysiology, we know that when the brain doesn't have access to intelligible speech during the early months and years of a child's life, then there isn't meaningful auditory input if we don't have that meaningful auditory input, then there isn't a coordination of activity between the primary and secondary auditory cortex. Instead, that secondary auditory cortex assists with processing of other functions, such as vision, but you don't get the same outcome if you have that cross-modal reorganization. We know that if we wait too long to get auditory information to the brain, past that critical period when humans are organically designed to have the synaptic growth that supports spoken language, then there's going to be a disordered function in connections and interactions between the primary and secondary auditory cortex, and that complicates learning. See, here's the deal. The primary auditory cortex, and obviously this is an oversimplification, but receives the initial auditory sensations. But it's the link between the, I'm pointing like you know where, here, between the primary and secondary auditory cortex. It's the secondary auditory cortex that actually launches the information through the rest of the brain. See, if you don't have that link between primary and secondary, there will be a reception of information if information gets through the ear, but the information won't have any meaning unless we can activate and connect to the secondary auditory cortex, which sends what Kroll calls a connectome model of activating other areas of the brain. When auditory signals, therefore, aren't efficiently and effectively transmitted from primary to secondary auditory cortex, then this information is not distributed meaningfully to other parts of the brain for that child's knowledge and information. So what makes someone smart? What makes someone smart is what you know. The more you know, the smarter you are. Well, how do you know stuff? You know stuff because information from the environment gets into the brain, and I'll talk more about that, and grows the synapses and connectomes and creates figurative data files of knowledge, of information. Our goal as audiologists is to make sure that that child's brain receives a lot of auditory information. There's a lot at stake in that. The bottom line is infants and children have to have very early brain access to intelligible speech and meaningful auditory information in order to fully develop and connect all auditory areas of the brain, in order to activate and develop that child's language and literacy capacity. See, literacy is at its core an auditory task. Literacy as a secondary linguistic function is built upon the auditory neurological basis of spoken language. So we as audiologists have a very large stake in the literacy development of children. So where do we begin? What's our responsibility? We actually need to connect the dots between hearing loss, auditory neural deprivation, brain plasticity, use of technologies, and literacy development, and explain this connection to families in a kind, compassionate, and meaningful way. We have to begin at the beginning. So the first thing I suggest we start with all of our families is a conversation. How do they want this all to turn out? What's the family's desired outcome? Because all of our management protocols are really based on the family's outcome. What's their goal for their child? How do they want to communicate with their child? What language or languages do they know? We know that at least 95% of children with hearing loss are born to hearing-speaking families. We also know, according to census data, that about 22% of UK citizens speak a language other than English at home. So a likely goal for many of our families is that their child will know several spoken languages. There's a lot at stake for that child's development, and it really starts with us in terms of understanding what it takes to access and develop child spoken languages. And the reason we want to know what languages the family knows is because really one of our parents, as a parent, our primary task is to teach our child our language. Is to provide information and knowledge into that child's brain. So you really need to know a language that you're teaching the child. You have to know words. You have to share your feelings and life experiences. You have to be able to connect to that child and make social emotional bonding. You have to know the language. We can't ask a parent to use a language they don't know. For example, could you raise your child in Mandarin? Do you know Mandarin? Oh, you don't? Well, do the best you can. We can't ask a parent to use a language to teach their child knowledge when they don't actually have knowledge in that language. And if the home language is not English, and yet that child, the goal is for them to go to school and learn in English, we have to add English right away by someone who speaks English well. So we have to think about how are we going to, as audiologists, collaborate with early interventionists and teachers to coach parents to make sure that that child's brain receives knowledgeable information from their families in the language the family knows, plus creates the platform in that child's brain for English as well. It's important for us to explain our terms in a meaningful way. We use words all the time, and we just assume that everyone knows exactly what we're talking about. For example, we say things like, your child needs access. Well, what does that mean? That means your child's brain needs to receive auditory information in order to develop their information and knowledge. Causal explanatory talk, not speaking in shorthand, but to explain what we mean exactly. Again, do we really think that all of our families know that hearing occurs in the brain and not in the ear? So, let's define some terms. And how we define terms and when in our conversation or conversations with families depends on the family, right? Our relationship with the family, where they are in their journey, how we can make sure that information is transmitted clearly in a way that's meaningful. Well, let's just start with sound. We just assume everyone knows what sound is. as Boothroyd explains, sound is an event. Sound isn't a label. You don't hear mommy any more than you hear a lamp. You hear mommy in action, walking, talking, singing, eating, because an action creates vibrations, and it's the vibrations that are picked up by the auditory mechanism. So, for example, to be accurate, we wouldn't say, oh, I just heard daddy. No more than you heard a table or a lamp. You heard a door opening and made the inference that it must be daddy because he was expected home at that point in time. You see, sound it's not another kind of vision. Sound, as we know, as a temporal sense, is a whole different way of organizing information from the environment. Audition is the fastest sense. With an intact peripheral mechanism, we can detect vibrations up to 20,000 times per second. You can't even see 20 times per second. Sound is an event, not a label. Well, what's language? We use that term all the time, like everyone knows exactly what we're talking about. Language is an organized system of communication used to share information, consisting of sounds, words, grammar that expresses inner thoughts and emotions. And of course, language includes gestures, facial expressions, body movements, all are part of expressing what's in our heads, what's in our thoughts, and our hearts, figuratively. So, how does instructional information get into the child's brain? And I actually do take parents kind of through this whole analogy, but the time it takes or the repetition, of course, depends on the family and the relationship with the family and the family's desired outcome, given that the vast majority of our families will be very interested in a listening and a spoken language outcome, because that's what they know how to do, is listen and talk, and that's what their family and culture is engaged in. So, how does information get to the brain? Well, the eyes are the doorway to the brain for visual information, but we don't see with eyes. Seeing occurs in the brain. So, for example, if a child is born with congenital cataracts, and there's a whole series of what that pathology might look like, the seriousness, the thickness, all of that. But basically what a cataract is a covering of the visual doorway. Now, if that visual doorway isn't opened by 6, 8, 10 weeks of life, then when it is open, that child won't see or see well, because the visual centers of the brain have to be activated very, very early. What about the nose? Nose is the doorway to the brain for olfactory sensations, but smelling occurs in the brain. Now, we all kind of know that, but do we talk it? You know where I'm going, right? The ears are the doorway to the brain for auditory information, spoken language. Hearing occurs in the brain, not in the ears. So these amazing sense organs, vision, olfaction, taste, hearing, all skin, all of these amazing sense organs that humans have are designed uniquely for the purpose of capturing environmental data and transforming that environmental information into chemo and electrical impulses that can be sent to and processed in the brain. Therefore, what's hearing loss? Using this analogy and this narrative, hearing loss is a doorway problem. We can think about hearing loss as a doorway problem because the ear is the doorway to the brain for auditory information. And hearing problems, auditory pathologies, whatever that is actually an obstruction in the doorway. Depending on where in the doorway the problem is, will determine the treatment for that obstruction. And we fit technology to breach the doorway. And in fact, the absolute only purpose of hearing aids, cochlear implants, bone-anchored devices, remote microphone systems, their only purpose is to get auditory information from the environment through the doorway into the brain. There is no other purpose. Now, we know in the maybe not too distant future, implants may also be used as a delivery system for drugs or for stem cells or for any sort of genetic changes that we might be able to offer to that inner ear. But currently, the only purpose is to, in our shortcut, access. The child needs access. But in causal explanatory talk, that child's brain needs to receive auditory information, knowledge from the environment to develop this connectome series of synaptic pathways beginning between the primary and secondary auditory cortex and then bleeding, oh, that's not a good word, and then spreading throughout the rest of the brain. We don't fit a hearing aid to tickle the eardrum or to wiggle hair cells. We only fit technology to get information to the brain. That's the only purpose. So rather than encouraging families or to say about the technology, put on your ears, because that isn't what we're putting on, is it? We should say, let's put on your, what are we putting on? The brain. Do you think families would not wear hearing aids if what they got was that their child's brain will be deprived of information if that doorway is not open? Do you think a family would put hearing aids, their child's hearing aids, in their purse if they knew you just put your child's brain in your purse? Because without that technology, your child's brain is either not receiving at all, or not receiving clearly, or not receiving at any distance or with any integrity knowledge. And the more you know, the smarter you are. And for all of our children, our job is to develop their brain in order to grow their potential. See, it doesn't matter what a person's potential is if it's not activated, does it? So, for example, using an athletic analogy, I'm from Ohio, and so LeBron James lives close by. We're like this, never met him. But you know LeBron James, basketball player, we can all agree that he has an amazing intrinsic capacity for basketball, right? But what if no one ever gave him a basketball? Who cares what his capacity is if it hasn't been activated and developed? Who cares? He happened to be born, according to the urban legend, in a neighborhood where everyone played basketball from the very earliest days. It was practice, practice, practice to activate and develop all of these neural connections with excellent coaching about how to refine his skills and practice, practice, practice those skills so that the capacity that he had was in fact developed. See, what's at stake here for us as audiologists and with families is getting information to that child's brain to activate and develop whatever their aptitudes and capacities might be. Because if their intrinsic capabilities aren't grown and developed, then what good are they? So, continuing with this analogy, an audiogram might be described as a way that we measure the quantity and quality of the doorway problem. And that's what we're looking for. What's going on in that doorway? Where might it be located? How serious? We often use the word deaf when we mean, boy, that doorway is closed, until we use technology to activate that hearing brain. Now, as good as our current technologies are, we know they are not perfect replicas of an intact doorway, right? That's why that brain needs extra enrichment, extra practice in order to develop the pathways, which is why we as audiologists must collaborate with, of course, the families and early interventionists, because once we fit this doorway device, information has to be entered in a meaningful, developmentally appropriate fashion to activate and develop that child's brain. So, what's hearing? Hearing occurs in the brain. See, when I have conversations with families, my goal is to use that brain word a minimum of 10 times in every single conversation. To use the phrase, hearing occurs in the brain, over and over, not just once casually in passing 6 months ago, but over and over and over, because what everyone needs to get is what's at stake is that child's brain development. It's a very big deal what's at stake. We know that hearing, that is auditory neural development and linking the primary and secondary auditory cortex with connectomes throughout the rest of the brain, is the basis of spoken language, if that's the family's desired outcome, and mostly that is, and literacy skills. Literacy is based on a spoken language, and social emotional connections, because we talk about our feelings. We display those. We use words. We use gestures. We use our facial expressions to convey our social emotional bonding. Anytime use the word hearing, think and say auditory brain development, using 1 billion neurons with a quadrillion connections. See, we're not working just with a few thousand hair cells, right? Not to minimize hair cells. Some of my best friends are hair cells. But the whole idea is we're working with this huge brain. I'm not even exaggerating, billion, quadrillion. And acoustic accessibility to the brain of intelligible spoken language is essential. And this is 2016. I expect, with very few exceptions, if there's no eighth nerve, for example, every single speech sound to be available to that brain clearly. See, children speak what and how they hear. That's all they can do. What comes out is what went into the brain. So if what's coming out of the child is English, what went in? Right, English. If what comes out is Russian, what went in? What? Russian. If what comes out is clear speech, what went in? Oh, and if what comes out is distorted, garbled speech, what went in, audiologists? Distorted, garbled, that's on us. That's on us. Our job is to get the clearest, most complete possible auditory data through that doorway to that child's brain for every single speech sound to be available at soft as well as at average conversational levels. That's on us. We can do that because what comes out is totally a function of what we got in through that doorway, through our technology, into that child's brain. And looking at our organic design, I talk to parents about, you have eyelids, right? What happens if you close them? What happens? Can't see. Earlids? No earlids. So what that means is, if there's a typical doorway, the brain of that person is open for auditory information 24/7. How many hours a day is the brain of a child with a doorway problem open for auditory business? However long they wear the technology. 2 hours, 4 hours, however long. If a child wears their technology, for example, 4 hours a day, it will take their brain approximately 6 years to receive the auditory exposure that a child with a typical doorway receives in 1 year. Think that child will be a bit behind in their language, in their knowledge, in their exposure to information? It matters how long you wear that technology. And of course, signal to noise ratio. We all have sound level meter apps on our phone. We have to use remote microphones and fit remote microphone technology on these children from the very beginning. All that's at stake is their brain development and their acquisition of information. Now, we have some really good outcome studies. This one by McCreary et al. Is really a nice one, a current one to use, because this tells us that, guess what? Hearing aids really do help. I mean, we know they do, but it sure is nice to have recent data that supports that. Collecting data on 317 children, 117 compared with normal hearing, recruited from around 17 states, and most of them had hearing aids, a few implants, and most were identified through newborn hearing screening. And, of course, children with any doorway problem are going to have a language problem and a knowledge problem if we don't get information to their brain early. Children fit well with hearing aids early, develop better language. Shocking, right? Now, what's really scary is the study found that over half of the children in this study were underfit. In other words, their doorway was not managed well, and their brain was not receiving the information that is possible to be received in 2016. The good news is that children with hearing loss, doorway problems, who receive optimal amplification and early intervention can actually catch up, but we have to be strategic and we have to be intentional, because any doorway problem places that child at risk for not knowing stuff, which will impact their language and academic progression. Other takeaways, fit that hearing aid early. You fit later, you're going to show delays that you can kind of handle with great fitting and a lot of intentional intervention. And the richness of the parents' or caregivers' talk that influences that child's outcome. This is all children. The language environment at home is the biggest predictor of that child's language and IQ outcome, whether or not that child has a doorway problem, which is why our early intervention has to be parent-focused. Has to be, because it's the parent who enters knowledge into that child's brain as their first teacher and teaches their child their language. So protection against academic and language delays arises from early and properly fit hearing aids, and you gotta wear them. We have a number, 10 to 12 hours a day. Eyes open, technology on. All that's at stake is that child's brain development and what they know. And of course, you have to have a rich linguistic environment because it's all about the brain. Technology, brain access tools, because hearing occurs in the brain. I suggest we start our conversations right with the brain. See, we tend to start with the periphery, and of course we have to understand the periphery because our job is to breach it. But the purpose is to get auditory information to the brain, and so that's where we start. See, the bottom line is audiologists are absolutely pivotal because until we do our job of analyzing and managing the doorway and fitting technology to get through that doorway to the brain, it doesn't matter how much someone talks. I had an early interventionist say, well, they don't really wear their hearing aids much, but boy, are we talking a lot. Well, you might as well talk to the floor, because if you're not getting into the brain, what synapses do you think are being developed? Our job is to get information. When we say that child needs access, what needs access? Their brain. And what are we accessing with? Information. Have high expectations for brain access. So here's the bottom line, audiologists. Continuity of audiology care is the necessary foundation for the development of a listening and spoken language outcome. Audiologists are responsible for having the auditory brain conversation. See, that's who we are. We're in charge of that auditory brain development. Thank you.